Now, to make all that good stuff happen, there are a couple of pretty major architectural pieces we need to know about: the Discovery Service and the Swarm Manager. And by the way, these are the icons I'm going to use whenever I refer to these services. Anyway, first up, every Swarm cluster needs a discovery backend. It's mandatory. But all it is a key value store, kind of a NoSQL DB, yeah, that keeps track of the state of the cluster and its config. So, no discovery service, pretty much no cluster. Well, as well as that, every Swarm cluster needs one or more Swarm managers, and it's the job of the manager to administer the cluster. So, for example, all Docker commands intended for the cluster should be sent to the Swarm manager. Then it's up to the Swarm manager to decide how to execute those against the cluster. So I think in the last clip we talked about starting a new container on a production node on premises with fast storage. Well, instead of having to manually find a node that meets those requirements and then issuing a Docker command against it, instead of that, we send the command to the Swarm manager and we just let the manager deal with finding the appropriate node. And sure, yeah, as part of this, the manager's going to need to be able to talk to the discovery service to make sure it's got like an up-to-date config of the cluster and the likes. But how much easier is that than a real person having to perform manual lookups? Oh, and the cluster nodes, right? These are just regular old Docker engine daemons. The only thing really worthy of note here is we don't normally talk to them directly. Usually, and it's best practice, that we go through this middleman here, the manager. Now, let's have a look in a little bit more detail. First up, Swarm supports a few different discovery backends. Right now, those are Consul, etcd, and Zookeeper, and these are all considered, I don't know, production grade or production worthy for want of a better term. Yeah, there is another option. You can currently use Docker Hub, but that is not production grade. So Consul, etcd, and Zookeeper, these are your choices if you want to take Swarm into production. And Docker Hub, the one that we sometimes hear called the hosted backend, don't go near it for production. And you know what? I wouldn't be half surprised if it actually goes away as an option sometime in the future. So steer clear of it. Now actually, there is a little bit of magic going on behind the scenes just to make these multiple backends work, okay? There's this nifty little abstraction layer called libkv. It effectively sits on top of these existing distributed KV stores and it abstracts the differences. So libkv is a library written in Go like pretty much everything else in the Docker world, and it's designed to abstract the detail of underlying key value stores. At the time of recording, it's used by Swarm as well as libnetwork for native container overlay networking. So yeah, I thought you might want to know that. Anyway, losing the discovery service, it isn't necessarily as bad as you might think. So if your backend KV store dies a brutal death and it can't be revived, the cluster config can be recreated. Just bring up a new KV backend and let the Swarm agents and the Swarm manager node repopulate the data. At least that's how it works at the time of recording. But you should probably know this. If you're using the same key value store to support Swarm and container networking, so the new overlay networking, then it's a different story. The metadata about networking endpoints and the likes can't currently be recreated like this. It's only Swarm data that can, so keep that in mind, right? Swarm data can be recreated if lost, but networking can't at the time of recording. Anyway, in the time that it actually takes to realize that the discovery service is gone, and then the additional time to rebuild and repopulate anew, during that time, your cluster's going to be on autopilot. So yeah, ticking over as normal, but not allowing any config changes. And in my opinion, right, certainly in production, configuring the discovery service backend for high availability is highly recommended. Like, you deserve a kick where it hurts if you don't. If you were working for me, it'd be mandatory. So, all three of the supported key value backends, supported as in the ones we said are worthy for production, yeah? These all support their own forms of HA. So Consul and etcd both support Raft, I think, which is kind of log replication of sorts. The point being though, the discovery service backends can be configured for HA, so that if one of them drops off the face of the earth, one of the others just kicks in, and it's business as usual. Which of course is great. Well, The same pretty much goes for the Swarm Manager. If the Swarm Manager goes away, then your cluster is effectively hamstrung. I mean, yeah, it'll still function in that containers already running will be fine. You just won't be able to run any more containers or make other scheduling decisions. So again, in real-world production environments, configuring the Swarm Manager for high availability is a must. Now, Swarm Manager HA works on the principle of a single primary manager, then a bunch of secondaries, or replicas as they sometimes get called. But there's only ever one primary manager, and it's the primary manager that's in charge of the cluster. So the primary is the only one that ever actually issues commands against the cluster. I mean, it's totally fine and it works to issue commands against the secondary managers, but what's happening behind the scenes is those secondaries are just going to proxy the commands onto the primary, who's going to be the one that executes them on the cluster. Then, in the event that the primary goes down, a leader election occurs and one of the secondaries gets bumped up to primary status and it's business as usual. And that's what we're all about in production, right? Business as usual. Well, I think that's the main gist of the discovery service and the Swarm Manager. Next up, let's look at filtering and scheduling.